Friends, hello. Today is the first episode in a series. There will be many but short episodes about a very important topic, cholesterol. Why is it important? Because it's one of those things that leads to people dying at a fairly young age. Yes, exactly, at a young age. You all think it might happen to you somewhere around 50 or 60 years old, but unfortunately that's not the case. If you look at the mortality statistics, the number of deaths increases every year. More and more young guys, 25, 30, 35 years old, end up in the hospital with heart attacks, strokes, and a variety of cardiovascular diseases. This cholesterol is the source of the plaques forming in your body. Plaques are deposits on the walls of blood vessels, which cause the vessel's diameter to start narrowing. If this plaque forms in a coronary artery, these are the arteries that supply our heart. A certain area of your heart's myocardium doesn't get enough blood supply, and possibly this is due to the narrowing. When you're sitting, it doesn't bother you at all. But if you exert yourself, the need for oxygen in this part of the heart, which is supplied by this vessel, increases. And if there is an acute lack of oxygen, ischemia occurs. And if the ischemia is prolonged, a heart attack happens. And unfortunately, if you have had these diseases, they will never allow you to fully recover. If you had a large, extensive myocardial infarction, it will always stay with you. Those scars on your heart will remain with you. That's why watch this episode carefully until the end, and you will get a lot of useful information that you should remember and never forget. What you need to know about cholesterol. The main thing you need to know about cholesterol is that the biggest misconception, which unfortunately is unclear where it comes from, is that most cholesterol comes from outside sources. That's not true. According to medical research, up to 78% of cholesterol, and according to some data, up to 85% is synthesized by our own bodies. That means most of your cholesterol doesn't come from food, but from what your liver produces on its own. And that's why when you see, let's say, a high cholesterol level, many people go on a fat-free diet and completely eliminate fats. Sometimes this leads to the opposite effect. Your endogenous cholesterol synthesis increases. Or the lipid profile. It gets even worse. I specifically Googled it. I won't say where, but on the website of a non-Moscow, thank God, healthcare organization, it says cholesterol is an important building material in the body used for building cells. That's absolutely right. So cholesterol is not evil. This is what you need to remember. Cholesterol is good, and you simply can't live without cholesterol. Because many hormones and many cells actually require fats, lipids for their construction. So here's the point. Let me read it. The normal cholesterol level in the blood is 3.2 to 5 mmol per liter. If the cholesterol level in the blood rises above 5, its excess is deposited in the walls of blood vessels as atherosclerotic plaques. This leads to narrowing of the artery and oxygen deprivation of the heart, which manifests as angina and in severe cases leads to myocardial infarction. To oxygen deprivation of the brain, which leads to memory impairment and stroke. There is, because cholesterol level alone is never an indicator of whether you are sick or healthy. Just by your cholesterol level, you will never understand anything in your life. And here it says that if it's more than 5, let's say you have 5.5, but what makes it 5.5? Cholesterol is necessary, but as you know, there is good cholesterol and there is bad cholesterol. The cholesterol level isn't just cholesterol itself, it's the sum of certain fractions. The first are high-density lipoproteins. High-density lipoproteins, this is good cholesterol because these protein structures take cholesterol and carry it to the liver for processing. These are exactly the high-density lipoproteins, and they are considered good. They take cholesterol and carry it away for disposal. So what happens if most of our cholesterol is made up of high-density lipoproteins? Because you added a lot of healthy fats to your diet, started eating red fish, avocado, or taking medications that normalize your lipid profile. And if it's specifically your high-density lipoproteins that increased, but your cholesterol also went up, then you're immediately considered a sick person. And it turns out that this formula, when we just focus on cholesterol levels, doesn't work. That's why if your doctor simply sees a high cholesterol level and prescribes statins, statins are drugs that lower cholesterol. You should never do that under any circumstances. And in general, even if you really do have high bad cholesterol, statins are probably the last thing we prescribe nowadays. There is bad cholesterol. Bad cholesterol is the one that carries cholesterol from the liver or the cholesterol you consume and transports it to the periphery. But what does bad even mean? We said that vitamins, their synthesis, sex hormones, all steroid hormones depend on it. They need cholesterol. Any breakdowns or damage in the vessel walls, for example, due to bacterial infections or systemic inflammation, also require cholesterol. So that all these so-called damages are patched up, like with patches. So it turns out it's not evil either, right? The body doesn't have such a function where it has good or bad hormones. Every hormone and every protein has its own function, and any good hormone and any good protein, it can become harmful if there is an excess of it, if it's released at the wrong time, or if the right amount isn't present where it's needed. So, low-density lipoproteins aren't bad either, because we need them too. Otherwise, how would we transport lipids through the systemic bloodstream? But the danger lies in low-density lipoproteins, especially if there are too many of them, and the ratio of high-density to low-density lipoproteins is important. There's even an atherogenic index which is based on this. It looks at what your cholesterol is made of. That's the atherogenic index. It will be more informative, and you'll be able to see whether you're really in the risk zone or not. The third thing they check is very low-density lipoproteins. Those are the bad ones. Or sometimes it's apolipoprotein B. These are small fractions. They're aggressive. They're dangerous. Stroke. What does it have to do with cholesterol? A stroke is an acute disruption of blood flow in the brain, and a heart attack is one of the stroke's companions. A heart attack is tissue death, while a stroke is a disruption in a certain area. A disruption in blood flow doesn't always lead to a heart attack. It can be a transient disruption of cerebral circulation. A blood vessel may have gone into spasm and then it relaxed. So, if a heart attack occurs, the heart muscle cannot recover. A scar forms in place of the dead part of the heart muscle. A heart attack can happen in any organ. For some reason, we all think a heart attack is only about the heart. Remember, a heart attack is not only about the heart. A heart attack can happen in the brain, lung, liver, or testicle. Absolutely any organ that has an arterial blood supply can be injured. In the brain, everything basically happens according to the same scenario, but the cause there is completely different. Most often, these are ruptures of blood vessels. Heart coronary arteries rarely rupture. This almost never happens to them, unlike in the brain, where blood vessels are affected in a completely different way. For example, this could be an embolism, like a fat embolism, or a regular blood clot. For example, it could come from the neck and block a blood vessel that supplies the brain. A part of the brain dies. If it's the part of the brain responsible for motor function, for example, the person loses the ability to move their arm. If it's the part responsible for hearing, they may become deaf. There are areas that are associated with the risk of death because they contain the centers for breathing and heartbeat. And if a problem occurs there, even microstrokes can lead to a person dying. Regarding strokes, it's also very important to consider the timing, the period of time. You started working on, for example, if it's a thrombus, dissolving it, breaking it down. Well, obviously, that's not the prerogative of surgeons. That's the prerogative of endovascular surgeons. That's the prerogative of therapists to prevent this from happening. But even young people, as you know, recently the athlete Joe Linda passed away. There was a rupture, an aneurysm. That is, maybe there was some kind of precondition, maybe the wall was thin somewhere. And with his training, the use of anabolic steroids, blood thickening, and the sauna drying that he practiced, he would sit there for a long time, right in that spot where it was thin. The blood vessel bursts, causing bleeding and soaking part of the brain with blood. This is called a hemorrhagic stroke. What is an ischemic stroke? Ischemic means there is no blood flow and a certain part of the brain dies because there is no blood flow. Why does this happen? Listen, well, here's a good example I came across. Someone mentioned rain repellent for cars, that stuff. So if we have a healthy vessel is like a vessel with a protective coating, like rain repellent. And regular cholesterol in the bloodstream just bounces off it and doesn't stick. But there are problems where for some reason this rain repellent system, this anti-stick surface fails. For example, with systemic inflammation, you smoke. Why is smoking one of the risk factors for developing atherosclerosis? You cause damage because of the endothelium of the blood vessels. Or you eat improperly, and the issue isn't the lipids you consume, but the systemic inflammation that you create. Or, for example, you use anabolic steroids like quercetin that also increases the risk of disease. Or if you have very thick blood and you also have hypertension, that also increases the strain and the risk of developing atherosclerosis. These are all risk factors for developing atherosclerosis. Plus, there are some medications that can damage the vascular endothelium. Also, there are certain diseases themselves that are risk factors for developing atherosclerosis. For example, this includes everything related to carbohydrate metabolism disorders, because the crystalloid damages the vascular endothelium and increases the adhesiveness of blood cells. Adhesiveness is the ability to stick together. Therefore, cholesterol by itself doesn't mean anything. If we don't have risk factors, that's one thing. And this elevated cholesterol is high not because of the good elements, but because of the bad ones, and there are too many of them compared to the good ones. So if you go to a doctor and he tells you that you have dyslipidemia just based on your cholesterol level, that's not really correct. That's why whenever I do diagnostics, I always include high-density lipoproteins and low-density lipoproteins as a basic part. Sometimes we go a little deeper. What other pathological conditions can lead to what you might encounter, for example, thyroid problems? By the way, there is an episode about the thyroid gland on the channel about its subtle signs. Check it out on the channel as well. Definitely. Really, if you have thyroid problems, it really can increase the risk of developing atherosclerosis. And the bad cholesterol fractions, because you process them worse, increase. If you have a sedentary lifestyle, that is not a very active lifestyle, you simply don't oxidize fats, you are constantly lying down, your mitochondria are not very healthy and are few in number, you also have impaired fat metabolism. Therefore, first of all, if you see a high cholesterol level, we always talk about an active lifestyle and we always talk about healthy eating as well. But just so you understand, the amount of cholesterol your liver synthesizes per day is roughly, for a man weighing about 85 kilograms, equivalent to about 15 to 20 egg yolks. So can you imagine thinking that just by adjusting your diet, you can get rid of high cholesterol? That's not always the case. Does it actually dissolve and go away if the body is healthy? Or does it only accumulate and that's it, only in one direction? So that it goes away. And that's exactly why we need high-density lipoproteins. And there is research on this also like that. I don't like to talk about them because there are alcohol haters, even though I don't drink alcohol at all. But alcohol, for example, also helps dissolve plaques. This safe dose of alcohol is 14 grams per day, calculated for any alcoholic beverage, preferably a strong one. It really is one of the options for lowering the level of bad cholesterol. Of course, you can dissolve it. There are basically two main groups of drugs, fibrates and statins. Usually they are prescribed together, but only when there are indications and nothing else helps. Prostatin. Everyone knows about fibrates, by the way, but for some reason, not many people know that, for example, fibrates increase the level of good cholesterol and lower the level of bad cholesterol. But both fibrates and statins have a huge number of side effects. Among them, they can damage skeletal muscles, cause myositis, and even cause rhabdomyolysis. That's why it's not a very good medication. It's not like a candy that you just take. Yes, it lowers cholesterol levels, but it has quite a lot of side effects. That's why there's a dose dependency. That is, the more of this medication you need and the more and longer you use it, the higher the chance of side effects. That's why it's extremely important to use it in minimal doses. And everything that's in your hands is to normalize your lifestyle, quit drinking, quit smoking, and eat fewer unhealthy foods. And when you hear me say unhealthy foods, everyone thinks about fats, but actually that's not the case. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates and impaired carbohydrate metabolism are the main cause of dyslipidemia, not excessive fat consumption. On the contrary, sometimes with a high-fat diet like the keto diet, fat metabolism can actually normalize. Right now, every second viewer of the channel is sitting and panicking, thinking, I work sitting down, I live sitting down, what if I have a blood clot growing somewhere? How can he quickly get checked and not panic? Listen, well, actually the blood clots that we are afraid of and that kill us in the form of a fatal outcome are clots that are most often located in the lower limbs. They can be checked quite easily. For this, it's enough to do an ultrasound, and if you have anything there, it will always be detected by a Doppler ultrasound of the lower limbs. If you're a heavy smoker, if you have a bad lipid profile, or if, for example, you're about to have a long transatlantic flight, that's also a risk factor. And I recommend that people who have the maximum combination of these risk factors, especially if, for example, they use anabolic steroids after such flights. Well, sometimes it might even be necessary to do an ultrasound, especially if they've had thrombosis before and if they have varicose veins. First, dehydration. Second, taking anabolic drugs. It happens when a person is either on a cycle or sitting on newspapers. That's 3. These are all risk factors, especially if you consume sweets, if you especially like to drink alcohol before a flight, or if you have varicose veins. What did we start with? These are all risk factors, and you can have those risk factors and not get a thrombosis, but you can also have none and still get a thrombosis. But as they say, God protects those who take care of themselves. So if you have risk factors, use low molecular weight heparin or cardiomagnil. 2 days before your flight, I would recommend you start taking it and continue for another 2 days after the flight. During the flight, get up, walk around, drink water, and definitely avoid alcohol and sweets before the flight. Lipid metabolism disorders, dyslipidemia, can also be hereditary. For example, my father had high cholesterol. I know about it, and you should know about your parents' illnesses too. And if your parents had a heart attack, stroke, or coronary heart disease, it means that you might also have problems with lipid metabolism. And that's a reason to get checked, because high cholesterol doesn't hurt, it doesn't cause any pain, it doesn't show any symptoms, and you often don't know about it until something happens, a terminal complication of its decompensation. That is, when the plaque is already so large that it causes myocardial ischemia, or so large that dissection has started, and for example, it has already dissected. Aortic aneurysm Lesha Miriakovsky, I competed in bodybuilding, and he died from aortic aneurysm dissection, and I'm sure, since he was a competing athlete, that dissection of such an aneurysm was in the pathogenesis, including lipid metabolism disorders. Because many drugs that athletes use, for example, Winstrol, really mess up the lipid profile. But if we take athletes out of the equation and look at regular people, I have a separate video about hormone replacement therapy, but basically lipid metabolism is something that sometimes with hormone replacement therapy in some people, if we're talking about certain individuals, is normal for some and not normal for others. It can get worse. If your lipid profile is getting worse, after 3 to 6 months you check it, then you definitely need to take omega-3s on a regular basis, resveratrol on a regular basis, and possibly cardiomagnil on a regular basis. If your blood is getting thicker because of this, you need to monitor your blood rheology. That is, if your hematocrit goes above 53, hemoglobin over 185, and your red blood cells have increased, then sometimes it might be worth slowing down and even either stopping hormone replacement therapy or reducing the dose for a certain period of time. But if you're on hormone replacement therapy, you definitely need to monitor your blood rheology. And not just a complete blood count, which includes hemoglobin, hematocrit, and platelets, but definitely an extended lipid profile as well. You should monitor it about once every 3 to 6 months. For a healthy person, I recommend checking it once a year, maybe starting from the age of 20 really. There's no need to do this, but starting from 30 or 35 years old. I still strongly recommend that you check your lipid profile. A lipid profile is to see what's going on with cholesterol in your blood. Regarding other causes, what other rare ones could there be? Causes, for example, a gallbladder. In people who have had their gallbladder removed, since there's only primary bile, meaning the bile that comes directly from the liver into the duodenum, they really often have increased cholesterol levels in their blood. Also, by the way, your lipid profile depends a lot on the health of your intestines and your microbiome. Many people don't realize this, but the health of your intestines and the microflora that inhabit you have an incredibly strong influence. That's why when you start eating right, many people think, I guess I'm just stopping eating fats. And that's why cholesterol becomes better. In fact, your gut flora becomes better. When you add fiber, your gut flora becomes healthier. You feed your gut flora with fiber, and it helps you lower the levels of bad lipids in your bloodstream. That's why proper nutrition is the foundation. It's the base, a moment for some honest advertising. Among the simple things that can help us normalize our lipid metabolism are basic foods like garlic or garlic extract. These include cinnamon, berberine, the enzyme CoQ10, alpha-lipoic acid, and omega-3. These aren't hard to find and they're not that expensive. If you have the opportunity to buy all of these or add them to your diet, then I think in 80 to 90% of cases, you can normalize your lipid metabolism without using statins by modifying your lifestyle. That means sleep, exercise, less stress, because stress also affects your bad cholesterol levels and a healthy microbiome. Please improve your diet and add the supplements I mentioned. I'll probably tell you more about them on my channel, attaching scientific research data. The link to my Telegram channel is below this video. On this topic, I would like to get a professional opinion from a cardiologist, a therapist, and many other specialists. And we are preparing a series of episodes. So if you want new episodes about cholesterol from specialized experts, from therapists, from sports cardiologists and nutritionists, then subscribe to my channel, hit the bell, and stay tuned for updates.